Hello, everyone, and welcome to American English Live Teacher Development Series 1. My name is Moderator Kate, and I'm going to be joining you today from behind the scenes. So happy to see everyone here. We're so excited for our second session in this exciting new series. Today, our session is called Exploring Generational Culture Through Oral Histories. And we're here again with our host, John Mark King, and today's presenter's name is Rhonda Petrie. Thank you so much for joining. We're looking forward to learning and sharing with you today. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and give the mic over to John Mark King. Welcome, John Mark.
Hi, Kate. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited about today's session.
Yeah, me too. It's going to be great.
Yeah, let's get started then. So, welcome everybody. It's great to have you here. I'm looking forward to today's session. We have a really fantastic presentation and conversation lined up. So let's get started. Welcome officially to our exciting new series, American English Live Teacher Development. Sessions for this series are held every other Wednesday at 8 a.m. or 1 p.m. Eastern Time from right here in Washington, D.C. We hope you're following us here on the American English for Educators Facebook page so that you receive notifications. Check out our events page to see all the other upcoming professional development series that we have there. So who am I? My name is John Mark. I work here in Washington, D.C. at the Office of English Language Programs, and I'm part of the American English social media team. I'm happy to be your facilitator and host today. We love seeing teachers learning and exchanging ideas. So we want to send a very special thank you to Rohan Sianipar at the Universitas Bayangkara Jakarta Raya Viewing Group for submitting this photo that you see, this photo of them participating in our first session of this series from a couple of weeks ago. Looks to me like they were having a lot of fun. If you are in a viewing session right now, it would be great if you could stop just for a moment, take a quick picture, and then email it to americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org. This email address that you see right here on your screen. If you send it to us, we may feature it in an upcoming session. So thanks. Now, let's take a look at our schedule for the rest of this series. You can see we have a great lineup of presenters and topics throughout the entire series. During our first session, we focused on creating a positive classroom community. During today's session and the next, we're going to explore topics related to critical thinking and to culture. Then, starting on February the 28th, we'll be focusing on getting your students moving and active in the English language classroom. All very exciting stuff. We look forward to seeing you for all of our sessions, which, as I said, 8 a.m., 1 p.m. Eastern Time from Washington, D.C. If you want to know what that means for your local time, check out the link at the bottom of the slide. So, a little bit about our sessions. Each of them is about 60 minutes long, and you're going to be able to respond to the presenter's questions in the comment box. So please do so. We hope to see all of your ideas and questions there, and we're going to do our best to answer and respond to as many of them as we can. So keep them coming. We have a great team of moderators. Thank you, Amy, Lauren, and Heather, for your hard work. They're working behind the scenes to answer all of your questions. Each session is related to a theme that you can find on the American English website in the Teacher's Corner section. That's americanenglish.state.gov. Coming soon on Teacher's Corner, Critical Thinking and Culture. So stay tuned on that page to check out the great ideas and the practical classroom activities that you'll be able to use yourself. Something else really important we want to announce. The American English eTeacher program is launching its second massive open online course, or MOOC, specifically for teachers of English. It's called Integrating Critical Thinking into the Exploration of Culture. It starts on February the 19th, and it's 100% free. That means you can register for free, you earn a certificate for free, and even all of the materials are free. You can take them and use them in your own classroom. So register at www.aeeteacher.org/MOOK. That's MOOC. You can also stay tuned here on this page for updates and posts and links to register. Participants that complete the course they'll get a digital badge, which is kind of like an electronic certificate that they can share on social media or on your electronic resume or CV. Also, today, you'll have the opportunity to receive a digital badge from American English for Educators. Now, like I said, it's a certificate that's sent to you electronically. So at the end of today's session, which is in about 1 hour, you'll be given a link to complete a very short quiz to receive your badge. So you have to answer 2 out of 3 multiple choice questions correctly, and then respond to a short answer question. So as long as you attend the event, you pay attention, you should be able to do it without a problem. But you can only enter your information once. So please take your time and make sure that you read the questions very, very carefully. Once you complete the quiz, you'll get your badge in about a week. So now, finally, today's event, exploring generational culture through oral histories. What can students learn from talking with their grandparents or their relatives and neighbors? What can students share with the older students in their lives? During this event, Rhonda will explore the advantages of incorporating oral histories in the English language classroom. She's going to then demonstrate an oral exchange project where students interview and present about older adults to learn about culture or history, society, technology, things like that. Through this project, students develop interviewing, listening, writing, and presentation skills. She will share sample projects, interview questions, grading rubrics, and planning guides. And it can be modified for different skill levels and different ages. So basically, in about 1 hour, you're going to have materials that you can use right away in your classroom for this kind of project. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's presenter. Her name is Rhonda Petrie. Rhonda is the director of the English Language Transition Program at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. She's been teaching since 1999, starting out teaching as a Peace Corps volunteer in Kazakhstan. Since that time, she's taught ESL or EFL to kids and to adults in lots of different settings. Her interests include English for specific purposes, project-based learning, intercultural communication, and program development. She's a member of TESOL's Awards Professional Council and is a frequent presenter at conferences. She holds an MA in English as a second language from the University of Minnesota. Okay, Rhonda, welcome. It's great to have you. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. Nice to hear from you and see you again, John Mark.
Yes, we're very excited about your presentation today.
Great.
And so I think we should just get started.
Let's get into it. Great.
Right,
well, thanks everyone for joining us and taking time to engage in this professional development opportunity. As this month's theme focuses on critical thinking and culture, I'm going to share a project with you today that can contribute to your students' critical thinking, reflective skills, and develop their cultural knowledge. In the next slide, got it. I can tell you a bit more about the project that I developed for my university level students here in the United States. But this project really originated as I reflected upon my own language learning in Kazakhstan and Switzerland. While I was living in those countries, learning Russian and German, I often had meaningful conversations with older people. These people took time to tell me stories and ask questions and were patient with my developing language skills. I still remember many of those stories that I heard, and therefore I wanted to create a similar experience for my students here. So I'm joining you all from Wisconsin, quite a far way from where John Mark is right now. I'm in the middle of the United States. I'm curious where our participants are from. If you would please write your name and the country or city where you are from in the comment box, that would be great to get to know a little bit more where we're all coming from.
Rhonda, we already have lots of responses. We have Sandy, Alma, and Lourdes from Mexico, Pavel and Balu from Romania, Ansam from Iraq, David from Angola, Rafi from Afghanistan. This is a lot. I have to slow down a bit here. Mari from Georgia, Christy
Wow.
from Bolivia, Lizzie and Victor from Honduras, and let's see, Irene is from China, and obviously many, many more. You're in Wisconsin. I'm in Washington, D.C. Let's learn together.
Don't we have the best profession that we get to work with people from all over the world?
Most definitely.
We're so lucky. Great. Well, as we continue to see where everyone's from, I'll share today's objectives with you from my session. My plan is to briefly introduce project-based learning, describe an oral history project, and offer some variations for how you could implement this project for different levels and ages of students. My intention for today is for you to leave today's session with specific activities and ideas that you can implement into your own teaching. All right, next slide. Project-based learning is something that I find really meaningful to incorporate into my teaching. I use a lot of projects because I find the value in students learning and the growth as they work on sustained projects over a period of time. Project-based learning starts with a challenging problem or ask a challenging question. This is a problem or question needs to be real and authentic, and it must require time to solve or answer. The problem or question needs to be meaningful and personal to the student. And it requires the student to reflect upon their learning and revise their work with the intention of producing high quality work at the end. And finally, the students create some sort of product that they share in a public setting of some sort. To me, these are the elements of high quality teaching and learning, which is why I find project-based learning such a powerful tool. And for our viewers who would like to learn more about project-based learning, I have listed an article about it at the end of the presentation slides. Now, on to oral history. So I have created an oral history project that I'll share with you today. Oral history is when people record and collect stories and information from people who have knowledge of past events. Through asking questions and telling stories, we learn about life and insights into the past in a very personal way, through talking with other human beings. Here's an overview of the project that I conduct with my students. In this oral history project, students interview older adults in which they ask questions about personal events, history, politics, and changes in society and technology. Students summarize their interview information. They create presentations that often include timelines, and they present their projects orally. Next slide. Before I get into the details about the project, I want to show you some final products so you can be thinking about them during the rest of the presentation. Here's an example from one of my university students. I know the font is a bit small, but hopefully it gives you a general idea of the product. In this project, the student interviewed two people, one person from the United States and one person from his home country in Brazil. The student included a timeline with certain dates that were relevant to both interviewees' lives, as well as other dates that corresponded with major world events that occurred in those countries and other parts of the world. The student included maps and flags to represent his interviewees in this presentation. This is a slide that actually the student created using a product called Prezi, P-R-E-Z-I. It is a free online tool that many students enjoy. And so it might be an option for some of you if your students have access to that tool.
Rhonda, very quickly. So we've heard from our audience. Sid Nabil says that projects in her classes are pretty common, which is great. So maybe a lot of the audience is already very familiar with doing different kinds of projects.
Excellent.
We also have a question. This is a pretty good question. Maria Nitu wants to know about what's the youngest age for doing a project-based learning lesson?
Ooh, projects can start early on for young students, and I'm glad she brought that up, because it's important to think about how you might modify what I share with you today to your language learners for their specific ages and levels. And as I go through, I'll show you some modifications. And in fact, the next slide shows another modification from a final product. This is a final product, not even a modification. In this product, the student gathered similar information through an interview, but used paper and pens and photographs, and it conveys the same information in a way that is appropriate to the student's age and level. This was a younger student. And so the final product depends on the age and level of the students. All variations are valuable because they're representing what our students can do and ought to be doing where they're at in their language learning.
Great, I love it. So not just different levels, but we had in the previous slide an example of a Prezi, and in this slide, something written and done by hand. So even if you don't have access to technology, you can do a project.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, technology doesn't make things higher quality. It's just a different way of expressing it. So it really is the process, the learning process that goes into these projects that matter, I would argue. Great. So I'm talking a bit about oral history, but now I would like you all, the participants, to start thinking about oral history. And I'll ask you to do this by thinking about a recent or a meaningful conversation that you might have had with a grandparent or an older friend or an elderly neighbor. What did you talk about? How did you feel during that conversation? And while our viewers are thinking about that, I might ask John Mark if you might answer this question for us.
Sure, a conversation. Well, I can say that not too long ago, I had a conversation with my grandfather. I have in my past professional life, I lived and worked in Eastern Europe. He was a pilot during the Second World War, and I only found out through this conversation that he and I were actually in the same places.
Oh, wow. The conversation element is so valuable in that. I think sometimes in modern life, we have a lot of access to tools and we're busy and we're doing things, but it's so powerful to actually be talking and communicating with people. Thanks for sharing that with us.
And we're getting some from our audience. So okay. Andrea Lupsa says that she learned a lot about communism from her grandparents and felt very fascinated by that. Benji Bazan talked about life in the past. And Elizabeth had a conversation with her aunt about what her life was like as a professional woman during her generation.
Oh, ooh, that really relevant, neat topics. Thanks for sharing those with us. On to the next slide. I want to share one excerpt from one of my students' projects. This student was, again, a university student here in the United States, and she included this in her final project. She said, my grandfather explained to me why he loves chocolate so much. When he was a small boy in Japan, the American soldiers would give children chocolate. Last summer, when I went home, I brought him American chocolate, and he cried a little. I didn't understand why he cried until I interviewed him, and he told me about his childhood. What I think is really special about that comment is that she said, well, many things, but she said until I interviewed him, she didn't know this story from her grandfather. And I think it's really powerful when we as teachers can create these meaningful learning experiences for our students. Okay, on to the next slide and the project. Like any project, there are many phases or steps to this one. Now, these phases or steps that you would need to do as a teacher will vary according to your teaching environments and your students. But these steps should give you a basic plan as to how to carry out this project. First of all, there's work to do in the teacher preparation phase. And then in the second phase, we direct students towards the past and oral history. Then we prepare students for conducting their interviews. Then the students conduct the interviews. And then finally, the students work on preparing for their presentations. I'll tell you about phase one. In the first phase of this project, the teacher needs to decide on some details before the students start working. First of all, you need to identify who your students will interview. In my setting in the United States, my students interview some older people in our university community town, and they interview one person from their home culture, which they usually do through a video conference or Skype or Facebook chatting. In your communities, in your situations, it may be different. It would be certainly different. And so keeping in mind this idea of communicating with one English speaker and one person from your home community, here are my thoughts for how you might do that. You might find English speakers in your community. These might be teachers or university students or international employees. And then the students, the interviewees who the students talk with, may be their grandparents or relatives or family friends, or maybe other community members. I realize it may be challenging to find English speakers in some communities, but there are ways to adapt. Rather than one-on-one interviews, you could have groups of students interview one or more English speakers. Each student could ask a question and the other students could write the answers. Another variation could be that students send the interview questions to a person who responds in writing. And if that might be an option you're interested in the pre-readings for this presentation, there's a terrific article titled "Using Letters to Tell Stories in the EFL Classroom." And that article really gives a good description as how you might carry out that project. One other idea might be that this is a project for a student who's ready to do some individual work or has a strong connection to someone in the community, and you want to guide them through more of an individual project. So that might be a way to conduct this.
We have a question from our audience, Rhonda, if you don't mind. Ansha says, how do we get students excited about projects?
That's a great idea. Well, it's not by handing them a boring piece of paper, I don't think. And in a few slides, I'm going to show you how to generate some excitement through this, through pictures and objects. Everything that I'm learning right now tells me that our students now really respond well to visual images. And so I'll show you in just a few slides how I would do that.
Well, we have one idea actually coming from our audience, from Nicoletta Militaru. She says that we use a memories box activity once or twice a year, where students interview their teachers and they find out more about their careers or other questions that they're interested in.
Ooh, with their teachers, what a terrific idea. This falls in line just with what I'm talking about right now. So thank you so much for sharing that. All right, so depending on your student's ability and level and ages, you may need to organize the interview with the person from the student's culture. With my university level students, They organize the interviews with the person from their home cultures on their own, and that person is usually a grandparent or a relative. Next slide. If you are designing a group interview, and because that fits in with your teaching environment better, you may be interested in this article on the American English webpage concerning the language experience approach. This article provides a lesson and activities that emphasize learning from a shared experience, and it's written for high beginner levels. I love using LEA in my teaching, and I would highly encourage you to check that out if that has sparked an interest for you. All right, back to the interviewees. I have one more idea to share with you. A few years ago, when I was developing this project, I saw this article about an organization in Brazil that matches older Americans with Brazilian students who are learning English. It was an interesting idea, and I wonder if this makes our audience think of other ways they could connect students with English speakers. If you have ideas, please enter them into the comment box. This way we can help each other brainstorm ideas. John Mark, will you keep an eye on that comment box and share some of those good ideas with us?
I promise to. In fact, I have one right now.
Perfect.
What if you're already using pen pals in your classroom? Why not make an oral history project out of a pen pal partnership? That comes from Brenda Madeline Woods.
Perfect. Exactly. Excellent contribution. Thank you so much. Right. We'll get on to the teacher planning time. As I mentioned in the next slide, in addition to identifying who our students will interview, the teachers need to plan the steps and the amount of time for this project. I include this slide so you have a general idea about what you need to plan for in this project. The length of times and activities will vary according to your students' ages and levels. But this is generally how I conduct this project. I factor in time that we need to discuss and write about older generations and people. This can take from 1 to 5 hours. I plan on time for students to develop questions and practice interviewing in about 1 to 3 hours. It takes about 2 to 4 hours to conduct the interviews. And then students need to summarize the interviews and create presentations. And this takes approximately 1 to 6 hours. And then they need to present the final product, which takes from 1 to 2 hours. And then, great. And in this phase, that was just right, phase 2. In this phase, we help students think, discuss, and write about older people in the past. So now I'll give you some activities that go along with all of those requirements for this project. Great. So this gets back to that question you just asked about, John Mark. How do we get students excited about this project, right? Well, I often include photographs, and I ask students questions such as these. Do your grandparents live with you, or do they live on their own? Or who are some older people you know? They're simple questions, but they can get students starting to think about and talk about their experiences and relationships with older people. John Mark, how would you answer that first question?
Well, I do not live with my grandparents. They live on their own. I know it's not always the case in the US, but that tends to be the way American families are.
Right, right. So excellent. Students from other cultures may have an entirely different answer to that question, and that can be a really valuable source of entrance into start thinking about oral history like this and our relationships to older generations. I also like to show students pictures or real life old objects to get them talking about what life was like in the past. At this stage, I also have students write, just free write, a free writing activity that I don't mark or grade. And when we first talk about the objects, I elicit vocabulary words from the students, and I write the words on the board and draw circles and lines in order to help make connections. And then after the discussion, once the students are more familiar with vocabulary, they do their own writing. John Mark, did you ever have a green phone like this one?
I had one exactly like it, probably not the same color, but I have very fond memories of turning that dial all the way around many, many times in my childhood.
Yeah, it was fun to do, wasn't it? Great. All right, so once we've started getting our students interested in the past through questioning and objects, and then we move on to phase 3, which is preparing for the interviews. And at this stage, the teachers are preparing the students for the interviews. And what we need to do here is help students develop their questions and help students practice their interviewing skills.
Well, so maybe now's a good time. We have a question from Abir Ali. What if you have as many as 120 students in one room? There's no space to move around. How can you do a project like this with so many students?
Yeah, that's a really important question to ask. I think there are some ways we might do this. It might be with photographs or at different times during the lesson. There might be ways that you would have an object or photograph while other students are doing other work. Those would be some ideas that come off the top of my head regarding large classes. Maybe it's something they go home and do. Maybe you send them out and say, hey, ask your parents about an object, or find something in your home that you know is more than 20 years old, and start thinking about it that way. Maybe you send them out to take care of that. Well, now we need students to get their interview questions. And there are a few ways we can do this. We can provide questions for the students, or we can have students generate their own questions. And if they generate their own questions, these might be examples of questions they would write or create. They might come up with ideas like, who are your parents? When were you born? Where did you live when you were a child? How much money did you earn in your first job? Maybe. What did you do for fun? Or another idea in the next slide is to provide themes and examples and have students choose a certain number of questions from each theme. This is how I usually manage this phase of it. And in the next slide, I'll show you how I conduct this activity. What I'll share with you right now wouldn't be so easy to manage with 100 students. But as we're going through it, maybe there's ways we can think of how to do this with a large class.
Rhonda, there's very little that's easily managed with 100 plus students, so no worries.
It's a lot of students to manage. I know. Well, I have a few ideas at the end of this. So if you do have a manageable number of students, this is an idea. I post questions and themes around a room, and I have students walk around and read and choose the questions they want to use. Again, this may not work with a large group of students, and if you don't have enough space to walk around in, but perhaps you could have themes and questions on papers and pass those around. But if you can have students move around, I think it's a good opportunity for them to physically move and engage with the material. Next slide. So now I'm going to go through some themes and sample questions just to give you an idea of the types of questions that students choose from in this type of project. There are lots of variations. These are just some ideas. Often students want to ask personal questions of their interviewees. These might be things like, what was the happiest moment in your life? Who was the most important person in your life? What are you proudest of in your life? Or what are the most important lessons you've learned in life? Can you imagine the conversations that would come with even one of those questions? Next slide has a theme of family. And this could be questions like, where did you grow up? Did you have any siblings? What were they like growing up? What were your parents like? Another theme is on the next slide about school. It's helpful if we can have our students asking questions that are sort of related to where they are in life. So talking about school, did you enjoy school? Are you still friends with anyone from that time in your life? What are your best memories of school?
Rhonda, these are fantastic questions. You know what I would love to do? Let's find out from our audience if they have any ideas of their own for questions to ask.
Excellent.
So people go ahead, start sending your questions. We'll continue and then come back in with your ideas.
Excellent. A few more themes for you just to get you thinking about this. You may have your students ask questions about their adult life, such as how did you meet your husband or wife? How has being a parent changed you? What do you do for work? Or what lessons has your work life taught you? Next, history. I like to have my students ask questions about history because I'm interested in it. And so asking questions such as, what are some historical events you remember? Or who was the leader of your country when you were young? Can spark some interesting conversations. And next slide, technology. A lot of students are, amazed that in the past we don't have everything that we do now. And so it can be interesting to ask, what are some technological changes you can tell me about? Or how has technology changed you or society? And finally, society. It can be interesting to ask older generations, what did people do for fun? How did people express themselves? Or what movies, books, and magazines were popular? To get to an idea of like what life was like when they were your students' ages can be interesting.
Well, here's some ideas from our audience. What was your favorite subject in school? That came from Benji Bazan. Maria Nitu writes, they might also talk about people that have inspired them and why they were so inspirational. Nishu Brenzea writes, what were some of your most beautiful memories? And Christine Mary, how did you transport from one place to another? I guess maybe how you got around when you were younger.
Right.
Oh, and Un Seda writes, who is your mentor?
Excellent. I'm so glad you reached out to our participants because those are really special questions to ask. Great. All right. So after the students have their questions, then they need to practice their interviewing skills. And I have a few activities that I do to get at this practice. I have an activity for building fluency, for learning polite phrases, and for conducting mock interviews, like practice interviews. On the next slide, I do this talking lines activity, which is a fluency building activity. In order to help students carry on conversations during their interviews, I organize this talking lines activity. In this activity, students line up in 2 lines and talk for 90 seconds about a question I ask. They are not supposed to think, just talk. Then, after 90 seconds, 1 line moves 1 space, so the students have a new partner. Then I ask a new question, and they talk again for 90 seconds without thinking. I ask questions such as, how do you spend time with your family? What job do you want in the future? Or what games do you play? This can get to be a very loud activity, but the students enjoy it, and it's a good way to practice speaking freely. Again, if you don't have the space to stand for this activity, you could also have your students turn and talk to the person next to them or behind them or in front of them. But the idea is spontaneous talking to build fluency. Also during this stage, I teach students specific phrases to ask for clarification and to ask the speaker to repeat themselves or slow down their speech. It's helpful for them to know how to ask these type of phrases in a polite manner. And these are phrases such as, did you say, or could you please repeat that? Could you say that slower, please? Do you mind repeating that last bit? Or, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. It can be really important for us to explicitly teach students phrases so they can conduct themselves in a respectful and polite manner.
I love this because you know what we're learning here, Rhonda, is that in a project like this that takes, several days in the class and lots of homework, there are lots of little opportunities to do things like teaching politeness strategies as part of it, right? It's not just the project, it's all the little things that you do to get ready for it.
That's right. There's a lot of little things.
As professionals in the field, that there is it means different to be polite in one language than it means to be polite in another language.
Well said, and it's such an important topic to
So I wonder if our participants can tell us in the comment box, do you teach politeness strategies in your classroom? We're very curious to know.
Great. I look forward to hearing about that. I love this topic. All right. And while you're teaching, it's also helpful to have students role play so they get the practice after you have taught something for them to practice that. We also have students practice by interviewing their classmates. I have students conduct these sort of mock interviews, which means practice interview, in order to become more familiar with their interview questions. They sometimes need to adjust their interview questions, but this way the students get more practice talking and speaking and listening, which is really valuable for most students. Great, and next, I also include some mini lessons at this stage in the project. I teach about punctuation and grammar topics related to interviewing. This slide shows how to use quotation marks with direct quotes and how to use the punctuation correctly. So for example, if the interviewee said, I had 2 brothers and 1 sister, the next line shows how to use the quotation marks around that direct quote. My interviewee said, quote, I have 2 brothers and 1 sister. Another example here is how to use the capitalization. If my interviewee said, next letter is capitalized and the period goes inside the quotation marks. And so I present this information and then provide exercises for the students to practice.
Well, this is another great example, Rhonda, of being able to have lots of little lessons within a larger project. You can teach punctuation and capitalization rules. You can also teach politeness, which, by the way, is a very popular subject for our viewers. Most people said yes. We had a couple of no's. Some people said that they don't teach it explicitly, that politeness is just part of everything that they do in the classroom. And Q, I think it's pronounced, says being polite is very important. Students need to know how to be polite when speaking English. I agree.
Agreed. And it's a really good opportunity for us to think about how we do express politeness using different words or phrases. I've had to learn a lot while communicating in other cultures, and I take the time to teach my students because I feel most of them do want to be polite when they're communicating too. There's one more slide where I show another mini lesson on how to use reporting verbs. In this mini lesson, I often talk about the say plus that plus clause construction, and because it's used often in written summaries. So again, if the interviewee said, I had 2 brothers and 1 sister, it could be written using the reporting verbs, as in, she said that she had 2 brothers and 1 sister. Tell works similarly. If the interviewee said, I worked in a school before I got married, the reporting verb construction is, she told me that she worked in a school before she got married. And again, after I present this information, I provide practice exercises for the students. All right, so we got in some grammar and some mini lessons there. Now we're on to conducting the interviews. And in this phase, we're getting close to the final project. We'll move on to in this phase, when the students are going out and conducting their interviews. They're ready, they have their questions, they practice, but there are a few guidelines that I like to keep in mind. Teachers may need to make final transportation arrangements if that's how you organized this activity. Students should ask permission if they want to record the interview. Many of my students have phones where they use the voice recording feature, and they record these interviews and then write later. I always advise students to ask the most important questions first, because often just a few questions lead to a lot of stories and really interesting information. So that's my advice to the students. And I teach the students how to prepare if a person doesn't want to answer a question. And we do this in a really respectful way. There are questions that may be difficult for a person to answer. And so I teach them how to politely move on and those phrases to use. All right, then we move on to the next slide about interviewing. During the interviews, which can take 30 to 60 minutes, depending on the number of questions, students should ask their questions and write their answers. Like I said, many students record if that's a possibility. It's not a requirement, but if it is, it can help catch all of those good details. And if possible, and the students are able to, it can be nice to take pictures so that the students can include those pictures in their final products. Not necessary, but an option. And then we're moving on to phase 5. We're in the last phase where students are writing, researching, creating, and presenting. And in this phase, the students are writing. And this stage often takes a lot of time and effort to write their summaries of their interviews. I'll show you some variations for different levels. At the advanced level, where my current university students are, they are required to write 500 to 1,000 word summaries of the 2 interviews, conduct peer interviews where they read each other's writing, which you can see here in this picture, and then they are required to revise their drafts. I don't want to see their first writings. I want to see that they have spent time to make their writing as best as they can, and that takes time and redoing it. At the intermediate level, I provide a more structured environment. You might have your students fill in the blanks by giving them the sentence starters, such as, I asked my interviewee about, he said, my interviewee worked at, she said her favorite childhood experience was. This type of idea to give them a little more structure so that they can complete an activity. And also at the beginning level, in the next slide, you may have a simple question and answer. Perhaps the students are copying down a question and answer a simple 1 or 2 word answer. All of these are valuable writing projects because they really meet the students where they're at. This beginning project is just as valuable as that advanced level project. I love this. Actually, my son did this when he interviewed my mother, and he likes to draw, and he really, and if our students engage like that, it's a great opportunity for them to be creative.
I agree, Rhonda. And we do have a question I want to ask. This is from our viewers. This is from Abir. I think I know the answer, but she wants to know, concerning evaluation, do we use formative or summative assessment or both? My guess is the answer is both, but you're probably going to talk about evaluation a little bit later, aren't you?
I am. I'm talking about the summative evaluation a bit later, but all through this project, there are many opportunities for us to provide feedback and guide our students towards creating that final summative project. So Yes, it happens all through this way. The students aren't just writing interview questions and going out and interviewing. We're giving them a lot of feedback and direction all through this project. Great question. A true teacher thought, right? All right. So I also incorporate a research element into this project. It might be appropriate for your environments, maybe not, but if it is, I have the students learn about other relevant events that occurred during their interviewees' lives. They often think about dates of other important world events. They might be interested in researching significant details from the interviews. They might be interested in topics such as the election of politicians, maybe a memorable sport or musical event. Often natural disasters impact us all, and that might be a topic that the students might want to research a bit more. The research focus, if you include it, will depend on the student's skill level and interest, of course. And the next slide, I give you some guidelines here about how students conduct the research. At the beginning level, this might be a very teacher-guided activity where the teacher directs students, maybe in a group setting, towards specific websites or books or wonderful librarians. At the intermediate level, this might be a semi-guided activity where we teachers are guiding our students to specific websites or books to look for information about specific dates and events. And at the advanced level, this could be a more independent project where we suggest certain websites or books, but have the students conduct independent research. Great. Then we're moving on to the final product. And this is the creative part of the project. And students need to have time to draw or arrange or work on a computer so that they can create a visually appealing product that they are proud of. In the next slide, I'll show you some options of the final product at different levels. And while I'm talking here, if other people can think of final products that might work well in a project like that, type them into the chat box for us, and that way we can all learn more from one another. You may have your students complete a drawing. They might do a handwritten interview summary or question and answer type of thing that we've seen before. You may have them do word processing on a Word document or a Google Doc. They could do a voice recording. They might create a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll show you a PowerPoint in just a few slides. This Prezi is this free online tool I've talked about a few times. Perhaps they create a very formal academic poster, or perhaps they create a paper poster like I showed before. All of those are valuable. All of them depend on where your student's at and their level. We'll move on to the next slide, but John Mark, if other people are sharing other good ideas, please let us know about them, okay?
Well, I have one I can share. What about a student-made video? This comes from Charo Jose Dorado.
Of course, a video, right. Thank you for bringing up yeah, of course. What a great way. And especially if students are really interested in like the production part of that, they could have good fun with that.
Mm-hmm. And Un Seda says, drawing pictures with a story below. It's kind of like drawing your own comic book.
Oh, right. That's a brilliant idea. We're so many terrific ideas out there. I'm so glad I talked about it. My project's going to be much better next time I do this with my students. Thank you.
And just a reminder to our audience, in the past, we did a great webinar on digital storytelling, and you can find it at americanenglish.state.gov.
Excellent. Here's a PowerPoint presentation that one of my students conducted. He uses PowerPoint for this oral history presentation. In the next slide, he'll show how he interviewed two individuals, one woman from the United States and one from his home country in Brazil. Here's some basic information about their lives. In the next slide, he goes through the woman from the United States and her past, what she was interested in, some personal experiences and her large family. Then he goes on to share information about her childhood and specific dates and some important components of her childhood, and then moves into adulthood, again, specific dates and some of the meaningful events in her life. And then he moves on to his relative in Brazil. Again, we see some specific dates and when they were the first love and what happened in this person's life. And just like before, he shares information about the person's childhood, and she got whooping cough, so we can see some of these medical situations that impacted her life. And then he talks about the adulthood and her activities as she was as an adult. And then he summarizes his presentation in the next slide in this very nice timeline. Sometimes the timelines are quite similar and other times they're a bit different, but what is valuable is this visual representation of information and getting students to think about what was occurring in these people's lives and the world at these different times.
You know, Rhonda, this looks like a lot of work, not just for the teacher, but also for the students. A lot of our viewers are asking how long a project like this takes. My guess is it's really up to the teacher, but something like this could take more than a week or two, right?
Oh yeah, you know, again, I have my specific situation. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks to go through all of these steps. That could be much shorter. You could do different parts of it, not as involved or even more involved. But that's why I started off the presentation with thinking about the planning time, because projects require planning time. They really do. It's not something you just
getting a couple of questions about feedback too, and rubrics. And do you have to make your own rubric for this, or are there any that are ready-made? That question comes from Duha Atala Hassan.
Oh, I'll show you one example of a rubric, but also there's a great website called Rubistar that I use frequently. After I talk, I could type it into the chat box. That is a convenient way to help us create rubrics. But
I think, from my point of view, a teacher-made rubric is always the best.
Yes, absolutely. This is a convenient tool to modify your rubrics. It just helps get the charts and everything well done. But yes.
Wonderful.
Great. Well, in the final stage is back to presenting, just the back slide there. And we can go back to that back slide, I show how the students, after they have completed their projects, they are ready to present. And presenting the projects is an important part of project-based learning. And it's important to have the students present their projects to an audience. And I organize these presentations by having half the students present while the others walk around listening to the presentations. I also invite guests such as other teachers and students and administrators. You could also invite other family members or even the interviewees, the people who were interviewed. And so as you think about this final presentation stage and all the work that goes into this project, think about all the shared experiences the students have been involved in and all the critical thinking and reflective thinking. It can be a really, really valuable project. And lastly, on to evaluation, lots of questions about it. I'll show you in the next slide of the rubric that I use. I divide out the visual presentation from the written summaries because that works best for my learners. And this allows me to focus in on the topics that we have been learning about during our time together and really evaluate them in this summative form like this. All right, and the next slide, I just wanted to conclude by sharing 2 more examples from my students' projects because I think they're very special, and I want you to leave thinking about the experiences young people have by talking with older people in their lives. One of my students from Japan said, "My grandfather told me that he received a letter to be a kamikaze fighter for Japan in World War II. However, my grandfather never had to fight. The day after he received the letter, the war ended. I never knew this about my grandfather. If he had gone to war, I wouldn't have been born." She learned that through this oral history project. And in the next slide is one more, where a student said, "I always knew that my mother had a tough childhood, but I had never asked her specific questions about her circumstances. By asking her to share more of her personal story, I learned that my mother and her brother were raised by their aunt in a favela, a small town near Rio. She never talked about her past." And I think that point where she never talked about it is interesting, because this project gets students thinking about asking older people about their past. And finally, I have a few references for you, so you can see where I got a lot of information for my presentation today, and also oral history resources. These are really fantastic sources for developing oral history projects, and even a great grammar resource project for those mini lessons in this project. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Rhonda, thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed listening and having this conversation with you. I'm sure that our audience on Facebook and elsewhere